One man, one decision. And now decades of US-India diplomacy are hanging by a thread. Could a single Indian really have destroyed everything? In a stunning escalation of tensions, former US President Donald Trump has unleashed a diplomatic firestorm, accusing India of unfair trade practices, threatening 25% tariffs, and even taking credit for a ceasefire between India and Pakistan. But what really shocked the world was his claim that one Indian individual triggered the breakdown in relations. As economic ties unravel and trust erodes, both nations are grappling with the fallout of Trump's high-stakes rhetoric. In this breakdown, we'll uncover the four explosive factors that brought US-India ties to the brink, and the one name that's suddenly at the center of it all. Let me know the tone you're going for: serious, dramatic, neutral as Seco, and I can tailor it further. Let's begin with what many see as the detonator in this geopolitical chain reaction: the imposition of a sweeping 25% tariff on all Indian imports by former President Donald Trump. Now, this isn't just another tariff dispute or a political stunt designed to rile up a voter base. This was a psychological rupture, one that signaled not only economic aggression, but a fundamental breakdown in mutual respect between two of the world's largest democracies. Trump's rationale, if we can call it that, rested on his long-standing grievance that India, in his view, has been exploiting the United States through what he labeled unfair trade practices. In his words, India is one of the highest tariffing nations in the world, and therefore deserved a proportional response. But proportionality in diplomacy is rarely blunt. This was not proportionate, it was surgical. A 25% blanket tariff on $85 billion worth of Indian goods effectively undermined years of trade negotiations, economic cooperation, and bilateral trust. What's even more telling, though, is the underlying narrative Trump crafted, a narrative that painted India not as a strategic partner, but as a freeloader. He called India's economy dead, an alarming statement not only economically false, but psychologically revealing. When a leader reduces an entire nation's identity to a lifeless economy, what they're really doing is withdrawing moral and strategic legitimacy. It's not just about dollars and cents, it's about dignity. And when dignity is denied, diplomacy dies quietly, often before we realize it's happened. The ripple effects were immediate. Indian analysts described it as the worst day in US-India relations in 25 years. Indian exporters, textiles, pharmaceuticals, IT services found themselves suddenly penalized not for underperformance, but for being Indian in Trump's zero-sum worldview. But here's the philosophical crux. When economic decisions are made through the lens of grievance rather than interdependence, they become instruments of isolation, not negotiation. What's particularly haunting about this moment is its echo of historical precedent. In the past, great power relationships have faltered not just from conflict, but from contempt masquerading as policy. The US-India relationship had evolved, painfully and gradually, from post-colonial suspicion to cautious strategic alignment. What Trump's tariff order did was strip that evolution of its nuance and regress the relationship into a transactional game. One where strength is measured not by cooperation, but by the ability to punish. And yet, what remains most disturbing is the silence in its aftermath. The absence of meaningful dialogue, the lack of urgency in reestablishing diplomatic channels. It all suggests something deeper, a shared sense of disillusionment. When a relationship is built on strategic hope and then battered by emotional impulsivity, what's left behind is not anger, it's fatigue. So what are we really watching here? Not just a tariff war, not just another Trump moment. We're witnessing a philosophical divergence, a test of whether two proud nations can choose the long arc of partnership over the short thrill of provocation. And right now, that test is failing. If we ignore this moment, we won't just lose trade, we'll lose trust. And once trust is gone, history tells us it rarely returns quietly. Now, if the tariff served as the opening salvo, what came next was even more disorienting, not because of its material impact, but because of its distortion of reality. In a now infamous statement, Donald Trump claimed that he personally brokered a ceasefire between India and Pakistan during a recent border skirmish. He presented it as yet another win for his so-called deal-making genius, suggesting that, had it not been for his intervention, the conflict might have spiraled into full-blown war. the problem. It simply wasn't true. This wasn't just a case of exaggerated ego. This was geopolitical mythology dressed up as diplomacy. And in international relations, narratives matter. They shape how countries see themselves and how they are seen by others. By falsely inserting himself into a highly sensitive South Asian conflict, Trump not only misrepresented the facts, but disrespected the agency of both nations involved, particularly India. It was India, after all, that had engaged in direct, back-channel military talks with Pakistan to de-escalate the situation. No American mediation had occurred. No phone call from the White House changed the trajectory. Yet here was Trump taking credit for peace that had cost Indian leadership and lives more than any outsider could possibly grasp. This kind of rhetoric isn't harmless. It breeds distrust. It reframes partners as puppets, reducing sovereign decisions to props in a personal legacy play. For a country like India, which has always guarded its strategic autonomy with deep historical consciousness, this wasn't just offensive. It was humiliating. And humiliation, unlike mere disagreement, leaves a scar. It alters not just current policy, but future posture. It causes countries to withdraw, to doubt, to second-guess every handshake, every promise, every word. What makes this even more psychologically potent is how Trump framed the entire situation as a one-man triumph. No mention of India's military restraint. No acknowledgement of regional diplomacy. Just a single self-aggrandizing narrative in which one American solves centuries of tension in a 5-minute phone call. It's the kind of oversimplified fiction that plays well in a campaign rally, but does real damage on the international stage. Because when you erase the complexity of another nation's challenges, when you erase its role in solving them, you're not being diplomatic, you're being imperial. You're turning policy into theater and allies into background actors. And in that moment, you're not leading, you're dominating. For India, the psychological impact was immediate. Leaders were forced to publicly refute the claim, creating awkward headlines and defensive press conferences. Not because they wanted to escalate anything, but because they had to protect their sovereignty from being absorbed into someone else's fantasy. So we're left with a sobering truth. Diplomacy that isn't grounded in reality is more dangerous than confrontation. At least confrontation acknowledges the other's presence. Delusion, on the other hand, erases it. And when global powers begin to erase each other, not militarily but symbolically, they set the stage for a far deeper kind of conflict, one where mutual respect no longer exists. And once respect disappears from the table, no deal, real or imagined, can bring it back. As the fog of rhetoric thickened, what became increasingly clear was that Trump's vision for U.S.-India relations was not grounded in mutual strategy, but in unilateral pressure. Nowhere was this more visible than in his repeated and increasingly confrontational insistence that India purchase more American-made defense equipment, tanks, drones, missile systems, and beyond. On the surface, that might seem like standard diplomacy. Nations sell weapons, partners buy them. But again, beneath the economic transaction lies a deeper psychological dynamic. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an ultimatum. To understand the full weight of this, we have to look at how India positions itself on the world stage. India sees itself, and rightfully so, as a civilizational power with strategic independence. It does not want to be anyone's satellite. For decades, it's walked a careful line between Western alignment and post-colonial autonomy, cultivating defense ties with Russia while simultaneously building economic and technological bridges to the United States. This is not indecision. This is balance. And in geopolitics, balance is often the most responsible position a rising power can take. But Trump's approach made no room for balance. He demanded binary choices, with us or against us. Buy from us or pay the price. And when India refused to sever its long-standing defense relationship with Russia, particularly in the midst of U.S. sanctions on Moscow, Trump responded not with understanding, but with threats. He floated penalties. He implied betrayal. He turned an ally into a suspect. This strategy, if we can even call it that, betrays a deep misunderstanding of how partnerships actually function. True alliances are not built through coercion. They are not maintained by forcing one nation to compromise another pillar of its identity. When Trump pressed India to abandon Russian arms deals, he wasn't simply asking for a shift in policy. He was asking India to fracture its decades-old strategic logic to become reactive rather than sovereign. That's not partnership. That's leverage. And here's where it gets philosophically dangerous. Because when you use power not to elevate an ally, but to test their obedience, you've stopped thinking in terms of shared interests and started thinking in terms of dominance. That's not diplomacy. It's hierarchy. And hierarchy doesn't survive in a world of rising powers who are no longer willing to be told who their friends should be. India's resistance to this pressure wasn't just political, it was existential. It was a stand not only for military flexibility, but for national self-respect. In fact, it may have been one of the few moments in this unfolding crisis where India drew a clear red line and said, we will not be dictated to, even by our most powerful partner. And yet the damage was done, not because India buckled, but because the ask itself revealed how little Trump understood the psychology of alliance. A true ally doesn't ask you to abandon your history. A true ally invites you to shape the future together. And when that invitation is replaced by demands, what's left isn't unity, it's silence. And from that silence, distrust grows. And then there was the moment that cut deeper than economics, deeper than rhetoric or defense contracts. It was the moment where policy turned personal, when 104 Indian nationals were deported from the United States, not quietly or humanly, but in shackles on a military aircraft, treated less like people and more like contraband. That image, bodies restrained, dignity stripped, returned to their country under the weight of state power, became a symbol, not just of failed immigration policy, but of something darker, the quiet dehumanization that begins when diplomacy loses its moral core. Let's be clear, every nation has the sovereign right to enforce immigration laws. That's not the issue here. The issue is how it was done and what it reveals. These were not criminals. Many were overstaying visas or caught in the gray zones of asylum claims and bureaucratic failure. But they were paraded as if they were enemies. Their deportation was not a logistical act. It was a statement. And when that statement is made with chains instead of compassion, it doesn't just affect those on the plane. It sends a signal to the world. India, for its part, responded with anger, confusion, and shame. Opposition leaders denounced the treatment as inhumane. Civil society organizations called for accountability. And among everyday Indians, there was something else, a quiet humiliation. This wasn't just a diplomatic slight. It was a psychological blow. It said, without saying, that Indian lives held little weight in the calculus of American politics. And that's what's most chilling about this episode. It wasn't just policy. It was performance. Deportation is one thing. Spectacle is another. And in this case, the spectacle was designed not to fix a system, but to satisfy a narrative, the myth of toughness, the image of control, the fantasy of a strong man saving the nation from outsiders. It's a narrative that reduces real people into props, tools to reinforce fear, to distract from failures, to weaponize identity for political gain. But here's where the philosophical fracture becomes clear. Because in any mature alliance, there must be a foundation of mutual respect, not just at the level of statecraft, but at the level of human dignity. If an Indian national is treated unjustly on American soil, and that injustice is normalized, then the relationship itself becomes unstable. It's no longer a partnership, it's a conditional transaction, one where human worth is negotiable. And when worth becomes negotiable, trust evaporates. Not in headlines, but in the quiet places where policy is supposed to become progress. In the meetings that don't happen, in the agreements that stall, in the silences that follow once the cameras are gone. What we're witnessing isn't just the deterioration of a bilateral relationship. It's the erosion of a shared ethic, a belief that two great democracies could build something greater together. That belief is now fraying. And the question we must ask urgently is whether we are willing to trade decency for power, dignity for convenience. Because once we accept the politics of humiliation, there is no end to how far we can fall. So when we step back and take in the full arc, from the brutal tariffs that shattered economic trust, to the false claims that rewrote history, to the coercive pressure over sovereignty, and finally, to the dehumanizing spectacle of mass deportations, we're not just looking at broken policies. We're looking at broken principles. And that is far more dangerous, because relationships between nations, like those between people, are ultimately held together not by deals or defense contracts, but by shared values and mutual recognition. When those values are violated, when respect gives way to dominance, when truth gives way to ego, when cooperation gives way to coercion, then what's left is not partnership, but performance, not diplomacy, but theater. And that theater leaves no room for trust. The story of U.S.-India relations is not over, but it is at a crossroads. What happens next depends not just on leaders, but on citizens, on whether we are willing to hold power accountable, to demand depth over spectacle, and to rebuild relationships not through pressure, but through principle. Because in the end, power may win the moment, but only trust can build the future.